Hi everyone, I'm the Rambling Photon, and today I'd like to talk about the importance of definitions. And I'm going to be using some entirely uncontroversial topics to illustrate this point. So, in the YouTube sort of skeptosphere community, if you will, there are a lot of times that gender and anti-feminism or feminism and stuff like that is discussed. And a lot of times I think that a lot of these disagreements end up coming down not to a disagreement of substance, but a disagreement on the definition of the terms being used. So, for uncontroversial topic number 1, I'll take gender. So, when the social justice groups use the term gender, the sense that I get is that they're using it with a different meaning than the way a lot of conservatives tend to use it. So, to conservatives, gender in English is conflated with sex. Whereas in the sort of SJW side, gender is conflated with identity. And when you do those two things, you end up with completely different meanings behind them. So, to somebody who thinks that gender is just male or female, they don't necessarily impute a lot of identity things onto that term. But to people who associate gender with identity, they can end up overblowing the importance of it. So instead of it just being one aspect of the person, it might end up being many, many, many aspects of the person, that their gender has to describe all aspects of them. And it becomes the core of their identity. As, you know, the gender expression becomes the identity and not just one aspect of it. So I think there's a disagreement fundamentally on what the word means rather than the actual substance. Because if you acknowledge that gender means identity, then it makes perfect sense that there are 6 billion or 7 billion or however many genders as there are people, because each person has a unique identity, right? But if you only assume that gender is one aspect of a person, then it makes perfect sense that there would only be 2, because the rest of their personality is not rolled up into that. So historically, the word gender was purely a linguistic structure, in the sense that it was a grammatical thing that gendered languages like Spanish, French, German had, but then there were some languages that were not gendered, sort of like English. Though English is still somewhat gendered in its pronouns and in a few other words that have not lost their genderedness from the parent languages, like actor, actress, or waitress, that sort of thing. But for the most part, English is ungendered as a language in the grand scheme of things. So the next completely uncontroversial example where definitions are extremely important, feminism. So oftentimes this is acknowledged because feminists who are attempting to argue in favor of feminism will usually cite the dictionary definition, being that it's the social and economic movement for equality, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Now, a lot of opponents of feminism are using a different definition. They are usually defining it as some sort of operational feminism, right? As represented by feminist organizations such as the National Organization for Women, or in feminist campaigns that are not necessarily tied to a single entity, but are maybe perhaps representative of the movement's ideology. And most people are not, they don't have issues with the dictionary definition, in the sense that if you purely go by that, they might consider themselves feminists. But because of the other forms of feminism, they disagree. And this is where, again, talking about your definition is extremely important. Because there are some people who will base certain claims off the dictionary definition and then conflate that with the operational definition in sort of the Motte and Bailey tactic. And if you're not familiar with the Motte and Bailey tactic, I'll leave a link in the description, which links to a much better article than I can explain it as to how that works. But the gist of it is basically you conflate a completely innocuous version of something with your operational definition, and then whenever anybody attacks the operational version, you switch it for the innocuous version and claim that they're against that. So in the case of feminism, it's if you're against any sort of the operational side of feminism, then you hate equality and you hate women, which might not be the case. Okay? The third completely uncontroversial topic where definitions are extremely important is abortion. So the primary question in abortion, I think, is when does life begin? And what is a human life? And those questions inform the entire rest of the conversation. And those are the fundamental problems that we see, is that we don't discuss that. And really, there's no easy answers. If you think that human life begins at conception, then abortion becomes much harder to justify. That's not to say that it can't be done. I tend to agree with the Justicar on this particular point, that even if you assume the humanity of the fetus, there are still arguments you can make regarding the preservation of the fetus versus the life of the mother. But it's an argument that I tend not to see from folks who are pro-choice. So here's just an example of how that argument might go. So if we assume the humanity of both the mother and the fetus, there's still the question of whether or not the woman has complete sovereignty of her body. And I think that it is somewhat reasonable to say that she does. So once you have that, then there's no forcing the woman to give up her claim to her body just because the fetus is a human. You are not required to do that for anybody. So, by that argument, even if life starts at conception, the fetus still has no claim to the woman's body. That doesn't mean that you get to kill the fetus just because you can kill the fetus, but you can potentially deny the fetus access to the woman's body, and if killing the fetus is incidental to that action, well, that's abortion. So, even without the, even with taking the assumption that the fetus is completely human, you can still argue the pro-choice position. But because there's never that connect on the definition and there's never that agreement, we never see those arguments. So for the last topic, where definitions get extremely important, and again, still entirely uncontroversial, veganism. So I think the problem with veganism is that the discussion tends not to be on the productive side because of the difference in definition of sort of two key things. The first is murder, and the second is intelligence and sentience. So the problem that a lot of people have with vegans is when they come out and start speaking and trying to convert and proselytize, basically, they accuse meat eaters of murder and torture, basically. And to most people, murder is killing another person and not killing an animal. Animals don't qualify. So right there, you're alienating your audience by accusing them of something that it doesn't fit their mental model. So really the core argument is not about whether we're killing animals, because we are. It's whether we're murdering them and what that means. Now, part of that has to do with how we think of intelligence and sentience, and how we think of basically experience and personhood. So that's an argument that can be had, and it's a very dense, and I'm not sure that it's necessarily productive because it's so nebulous. But the question of what defines personhood. Now, if you can define personhood in a way that everybody agrees on, that also allows animals to be qualified as persons, then you can start making the argument that, well, killing persons is murder, killing people is wrong, and so we shouldn't do it for food. That could be a productive conversation. But in my experience, what happens is vegans then just start screaming that you're a murderer rather than actually talking about and discussing the personhood or not personhood of different animals. And it also sort of potentially can give them a tough spot, because depending on how they define personhood or life, you might be able to argue that certain plants might qualify, in which case then they can't eat plants. So that might be fun. But anyway, so those are just some of my thoughts on the importance of definitions in argumentation, and why we need to really get down and agree on the core issues, or the core language that we use to discuss these, so that productive conversations can happen. Anyway, if you like my content, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that shit. And if you don't like it, leave a comment explaining why, and I'll try and fix it or get back to you, or, whatever. Anyway, hope to catch you next time.